In other words, legislation that would do that. That's what they tried to do basically in the 1970s and failed. And so they knew they couldn't do it yet to the American people. They still could not get a bill through Congress. So what they did is to enable to improve this management of urban expansion, they created comprehensive planning, smart growth. And what happened is that in 1976 through 1998, they published, not 1976, 1996 through 98, they published all of these sub-books that give some explicit language. And you can look them up on the internet. The website is right there. And read them for yourselves. They're very explicit in what they are intended to do. And remember that now every federal agency has redirected its mission statement to really go along with Agenda 21 and Sustainable America, and our agencies are no longer there to assist the local person, but they are to protect the environment from the local individuals. It's a radical change in direction that our federal agencies made in the mid-1990s. If you've ever had to deal with the federal agencies, most people out west saw it immediately, because all of a sudden the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, agencies that have always been difficult to work with, became impossible to work with, because they weren't there to help the individual anymore. They were there to stop them. It really has had an impact on how our federal government does that, and especially in the areas of transportation. If you look at energy and transportation, I'm just going to scan this just a little bit. Some good news, by the way. The ISTEA, by the way, the ISTEA is the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act of 1991, which was revised in 1996. That's when it was decided to shift much of your federal transportation money from highways into other alternative methods of transportation, specifically and especially rail, light rail. And if you remember, Gateway 1 starts out by saying that the idea of building new highways is kind of passe now and so forth. Well, that's why. Because all of a sudden the emphasis was taken off of the U.S. Department of Transportation away from highway building and into light rail building. Should permit states or regions to choose and invest federal transportation funding for intercity rail projects. And this is one of the recommendations from Gateway. They're not saying it should be done, they're just saying the opportunity exists. In section or policy recommendation number 5, state and local governments should be enabled and encouraged to develop market-based transportation management strategies that more fully reflect the cost of travel. And I've seen this being done all across the country as I travel around the country. And it says specifically, existing U.S. Department of Transportation Intelligent Transportation Systems, the ITS, funding should be targeted to promote flexible road pricing applications. For example, charging by the time of day, vehicle type, number of occupants, and so forth. That's being done in other states around the country. It is not a recommendation of the Gateway Project. I don't know if they deliberately shied away from that, but I'm glad they did, because I don't think that is a very valid way of doing something. So that's a plus. The big one is the sustainable communities. I'm only going to give you a little bit of this. You really should download this one and read it for yourself, because it's mind-bending. In action item number 4, local governments and counties can create community partnerships to develop regional open space networks and urban growth boundaries Now, what is an urban growth boundary? That has been now almost 40 years. Portland, Oregon was the first one that started it. And let me just give you a picture of that. Here you have an urban growth boundary. 20 years ago, it was the same on both sides. Somebody drew a pencil mark on a map, and on the left side, you can develop, on the right side, you cannot develop. And what happens is the person who is a farmer that owns land at $15,000 an acre, let's say, all of a sudden, it still has land at $15,000 an acre. The guy on the right, and we have a lot of examples of this, who owned the same land at $15,000 an acre before that pencil line was drawn, now owns land at several $100,000 an acre, if not $1 million an acre, because what happens is, as soon as that pencil line is drawn, all of a sudden land becomes limiting. There's only so much land now that it can be expanded into. And that land, and I'll show you some examples of some studies and so forth that actually just blow your mind. But it is horribly expensive because the escalation of land value just skyrockets right through the ceiling. And this is one of the big damning features of smart growth. Is it because it opens the door to corruption. And they have found plenty of it, folks, where they have tried to do this. Bribes and so forth, because it makes a huge difference what side of the line you're on. It's horrifying to realize how much this opens the door to corruption. So that's the urban growth boundary. In Chapter 2 of the Gateway Project, it has the same concept built in, where they call it the necklace of pearls or something like that. I can't remember exactly what they call it. It's an accurate description. But where they really force the growth and development into small areas. Now, they don't say how to do that. At least I didn't find that in the document. Some of you who have read it very closely might have. But the fact is that the same thing and the same potential problem exists in the Gateway Project. Now, if you're aware of it and you want to do this because it makes sense because of the recreation potential and so forth such a thing might offer, that's your decision at the local level to do. I'm not trying to say you shouldn't do it or not, but be aware that people are going to be hurt in this process. Now, this is where I give the Gateway 1 crew a lot of credit because they realize this. And as a consequence, they called for an innovative strategy called the Purchase and Transfer of Trip Rights, which is designed to assure that property owners in the corridor are treated equitably while development is being focused and designated in core areas. In other words, they recognize there's just going to be inequitable, whatever. my tongue is getting ahead of my brain, I guess. And they try to ameliorate that. And so what they're doing is calling for a transfer of development rights. Now let me just emphasize that down here at the bottom. A transfer of development rights. Those people that live in a half-mile section north or south of US 1 or 90, as the case might be, would be, if they want to sell it, they will be given a higher than their land value is worth to make up for the difference what they would have lost or might have gained had there been no zoning to this effect at all. Now, this is actually the first time I've seen this in any plan across the country. So I give my hat to this crew that developed this plan. They tried to reduce what could be a very inequitable situation so that both rural and urban citizens can benefit from this. The problem that you have to ask then is who actually pays these rural landowners for their loss. Yeah, hold on to your wallets. That's the weakness, one of the weaknesses. And that's not defined yet how they're going to do that, at least not that I could read in the book, in the project. So that is really one of the main flaws of this. And how are you going to know, say in 20 years, what that land should be worth so that you can pay a compensatory price to that rural landowner when he goes to sell his land? It's really a very difficult, knotty situation. And even though I give them credit for trying to tackle it, it's still one of those things where it's not going to really, I think, be a workable deal. In fact, what I think will happen eventually is that all of these questions, and let me just go on here and look a little bit more. Under Maine's Interlocal Cooperation Act, an agreement for a joint exercise of powers must be specify the following things. In other words, the plan hasn't been written yet. They've just got this outline. They've got yet to define the duration. It's going to last 20 years, 30 years, in perpetuity, whatever. The precise organization, composition, and nature of the separate legal and administrative entities created by the agreement together with the powers delegated to that entity. And what they're going to find is that the more they try to do this and be fair, the more they have to control private property rights. You just can't do it any other way. You have to have the ability to control private property rights. And so I see that as a real weakness of Gateway 1. It's not necessarily a fatal weakness, but it is a weakness that has to be addressed. Number 4, the manner of financing the joint cooperation undertaking and establishing and maintaining a budget for the undertaking. How are you going to finance all of this? We talked about that just a moment ago. There's no other way you can do it but to hit the taxpayers. And is somebody from Augusta going to have to pay for someone here along the corridor? Is that fair? I mean, these are valid questions. The method to be used to partially or completely terminate the agreement and to dispose the property upon the termination. So, and that's a very valid question too. How are you going to end this if necessary? I'm not saying you shouldn't go ahead with the Gateway 1 project. But what I'm saying is, and I'll get to this in a moment, any step that requires the restriction of private property by an unelected official should be red flags all over. Because that's regional government in which the bureaucrats have no accountability whatsoever to the local citizens. And they can basically do, that's what happens in the Adirondack Park, it's what happens in Lurk, and it's a very, very dangerous situation. Also, you got the Maine State Planning Office. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I really kind of think, I think that Maine would be better off without the planning office. Excuse me if somebody from the planning office is in here. But every planning office that I have seen just causes more problems than it helps. Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Highway Administration, and the key thing here is that these agencies will be non-voting members, which is a good thing. But they still hold the purse strings. So again, you have pluses and minuses in this process. Now there was one other thing that the housing, there was another publication called Towards a Sustainable America, published in 1998 by the U.S. Housing Urban Development. It was then a huge grant was given to the American Planning Association. Remember, that was one of the two, the APA and ICLEI, to actually write up a couple of dozen different off-the-shelf plans that almost any community or state can take off the shelf